Time for our speaker. So, good afternoon. Welcome to the Spring 2019 Shipka Speaker Lecture. My name is Dr. Michael Jerryson, Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies. And it's wonderful to see so many of you here today. Today's lecture is sponsored by the Dr. Thomas A. and Albert J. Shipka Speaker Series, which is the second largest lecture series on campus. Dr. Tom Shipka is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy, and his father, Albert J. Shipka, was a long-standing meeting leader in Ohio and a former member of YFU's Board of Trustees. We are very grateful to a group of alumni and community, university donors, who we call the Philosophy Circle, for their significant contributions to the series and to our department, and makes things like this possible. Before I introduce our guests, a few matters. One, the ubiquity of cell phones. Please make sure to turn them off or silence them. That way, with our recording, they won't hear dings and interesting little chimes throughout this. Also, if you have extra credit forms, they're standing handing them out there, but at the end, you can also pick them up as well, too. After talk, we'll have a 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Please keep in your seats until we finish the Q&A, so as not to disrupt the event. And you will have plenty of time to get to your next class by doing this. We will have a reception shortly after this, so if in the 10-15 minutes we haven't covered all their questions, don't worry. Dr. Mark Juergensmeyer will be in the reception at the President's Suite with food and drinks. So, for food, free food, out there. Now, I felt that it's important to speak a little bit about religious studies. I'm going to be a religious studies speaker. The Pew Research Center and the American Academy of Religions organization conducted surveys across the United States to see if colleges and universities that have departments like we have at YSU, what they think of religious studies. And what they found was that most of the faculty and students and staff didn't have a clue what we did in religious studies. And due to this continued confusion over my discipline, I feel compelled to explain a little bit about what we do. The goal is to examine religion, its relevance in economics, politics, psychology, and society at large. Religion is a part of people's lives, whether it's a type of their theism, a belief in divinities, or an atheism, a rejection of theism. We often conflate religion with theism. It's not the case. And whichever way we turn, religion has had quite an impact, whether it's through therapeutic exercises, pastoral counseling, or political influences, which have been evident quite recently. The sheer economic factor of religion is staggering. In the United States alone, count the churches, the organizations, they earn over $1.2 trillion a year. A lot of money, if not for profit. Which is equal to the 15th largest national economy in the world. In light of the importance in our lives, and particularly we have such an esteemed scholar as we have here today, Dr. Mark Juergensmeyer. Dr. Juergensmeyer was, as I understand, one of the last students of Reinhold Niebuhr at the University of California, Berkeley, in political science. After leaving there, he's done so many amazing things. He helped create international studies, was one of the first founding deans in Hawaii. He went to the University of California, Santa Barbara, established the Global Studies Department there, which has one of the few PhD programs in the country studying transnational operations and global issues. He's, among other things, though, he's done many other besides this, though. He was the president of the American Academy of Religions organization, the head of it, which has the 11,000 members, the largest in the world, who is the president of this. And he has so many amazing books that have been very influential. The first I came across was Terror in the Mind of God, The Global Rise of Religious Violence. Now, Wikipedia is actually wrong on this. I think it says it was published in 2003. It was not. Dr. Juergensmeyer was working on this prior to 9/11. And I had the privilege of TAing his course in the fall of 2001, right after 9/11. And this work shed light on 9/11 and goes prior to and after that. And it's now in its 4th edition. Although, personally, I think this cover is my favorite. But he's not just doing religion. Dr. Juergensmeyer does so much with globalization. Another great book that he has First was called the New Cold War, which nationally confronts the secular state. That was also then later on retitled as, and expanded significantly in Global Rebellion. Religious challenges the secular state from militias to Al-Qaeda. Dr. Juergensmeyer has traveled extensively around the world. He just came back from Iran. He's been to Syria, India, been to the Philippines. Whenever I hear context from him, it's like, where is Dr. Juergensmeyer? He's always somewhere really important, interviewing people on the ground, seeing what's happening there. He's been on CNN, so many other talk shows, looking at his expertise. And in light of all this tremendous contributions to our world, international studies, like religion, I'm so excited that he's here today to speak on the global rise of religious violence. And so it's with great honor to have such an influential scholar with us today. Please welcome me in welcoming Dr. Mark Juergensmeyer.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Michael, for that wonderful introduction. And you'll get that commission I promised you, the discount for all those books that you've been immodestly hawking in front of everybody, which are, of course, suitable for birthdays and for, Christmas and for graduation and, bar mitzvahs, Ramadan. Anyway, he'll see him afterwards. I think he's going to put up a little stand to sell some of these books. Thank you, Michael, very much. It is such an honor and a privilege to be here in this beautiful campus. And to be a part of this very distinctive lecture series. And I understand that we have a real-life Shipka with us today. And I want to thank you and your family for thinking sufficiently of the importance of this topic and the role of philosophy and religion and in the life of the campus community and the life of the community in general to endow this series. And this is really a great thing to do, and I want to thank you for that. And to tell you how privileged I feel to be a part of this series. And I want to apologize a bit for my voice. As Michael said, I've just been in Iraq for a couple of weeks interviewing people who are both victims of ISIS in the refugee camps near Mosul. And also, for the first time, I've actually talked with members of ISIS, people who are in prison, to try to get a sense of in their mindset. That's been the whole project in which I've engaged for the last 30 years, to try to get inside the mindset of people who think about the world quite differently than we do and get involved in what we see as horrible acts of terrorism. But in their own mind, it makes a certain kind of sense. And I try to figure out why, what kind of sense. And so I'm still trying to do this, and I came back with a horrible cold. I don't think I got this in Iraq. I think it's the benefit of United Airlines and 24 hours of breathing recircled germs in the air. But I apologize if I sound a little bit like an asthmatic frog. It's not my normal voice. But there's a lot I want to share with you, because this is an interesting and important topic. We all thought at the end of the Cold War that things were going to become different. We thought that at the end of the Cold War that suddenly it was the end of ideologies and no more ideological disputes, that people were going to be normal, secular nations like everybody else. Well, that's not what happened. What we saw was this awful rise of religious and ethnic violence around the world. In a sense, not a new kind of globalization, but a kind of anti-globalization. And the question was why? Why is this happening now? And what does religion have to do with it? These are two questions that have puzzled me 30 years ago when I first started looking at this topic, and which still puzzle me. They've been in the occupation of a series of books, including the ones that Michael just talked about, Global Rebellion, God in the Global Square, and this fourth edition of Terror in the Mind of God. But the story isn't over yet. I still don't have complete answers to those two haunting questions. What does religion have to do with this, and why is this happening now? And I have to say, these questions didn't come out of a vacuum. It all started with the situation in India, with the rise of Sikh nationalism in the 1980s, and led by this guy, Sanjarnal Singh Bhindranwale, the kind of putative leader of the movement. And this struck me as interesting, not only because my background is in religion and politics, as Michael says, but also because I lived in this part of India for several years. I knew these people. These were the kids that I taught in Punjab University in my classes. And These are the people I hung around with. I don't know whether you know many Sikhs, but I love Sikh people. Sikhs are buoyant, active, friendly, engaging. They're just, I like to think of them as the Californians of India. That's a compliment in case you're curious. You know, they're just great, lively people. And then to see them involved in this awful spiral of violence between young Jat Sikh men and the Indian government, bombings and airplane hijackings and buses load of Hindu pilgrims are stopped and then set on fire and people roasted alive. How could this happen? And what did religion have to do with it? So that's the first case study that excited me for, not just for intellectual reasons, but for personal reasons. I wanted to know why. So in the mid-1980s, after the attack on the Golden Temple in which Bhindranwale was killed, I went back to the Punjab, and by the time he was gone, but I could listen to his videotapes and I could talk with people, his supporters, and I was trying to figure out why. What is it? What was it? What was going on here? Because what I thought, what people said that they were told about religion and politics is that often religion will be used by wily politicians, right? Politicians are out to try to use religion for their own mischievous purposes. That's not what I found with Bhindranwale. Bhindranwale was not a politician. He was just a country preacher. The country preacher came out of a rural area of the Punjab. In the videotapes, you hear him, he was not a particularly good speaker, but he was a kind of mesmerized. He had to look out over the crowd like this, and almost invariably be young Sikh men. And you look out at them and they say, look at you. You shave your hair and you cut your beards. The Sikhs are supposed to let their hair grow out. He said, you're wearing fancy clothes and shiny shoes and slick outfits, and you're hankering after government positions and fancy positions within the university. You've lost it. You don't know what's really going on in life. So you're seeking the easy way, but there's a war going on. There's a battle between good and evil and right and wrong and religion and irreligion. And it's happening right now all around you. And the time has come for you to get true with the gurus, with your forefathers, and join the struggle and be transformed. Wow, that's exciting talk. What young person wouldn't be suddenly awakened with the idea, whoa, there's a great battle, I can be a part of it. And I have to tell you, when I heard this, I said, I've heard this before. Well, that means I didn't grow up as a Sikh in Punjab. I grew up as a Protestant kid in the Midwest in southern Illinois, not too far from here, in a rural area which gets incredibly dull, especially in the summer, until the revival tent comes around. And then suddenly everything comes to life and people are full of enthusiasm, they're full of the Spirit. I remember there was one preacher, he was wearing camouflage, a military outfit, and he stood up in front of us and he said, you young people, look at you, you're leading your messy lives, you don't know what you're doing with yourself, you're hankering after some kind of personal fame or fortune, but you don't understand, there's a war going on. There's a battle between good and evil and right and wrong and religion and irreligion, and it's happening right now. The time has come for you to get right with the Lord and fight, to take up the sword of truth and to fight for your salvation. The time has come right now for you to come to the sawdust path, come down the sawdust road and be saved. Hallelujah. Wow. I mean, I myself was saved on several occasions. Because who wouldn't be excited about this kind of challenge to do so? Everybody has messy lives, let's admit it. The challenge to want to do something important, to be somebody important, to actually to pick up a fight. I mean, why do you think kids at 11 years old are watching computer games and they're games invariably about warfare. It's about battle. They can be engaged, they can be involved, they can actually be a part of the forces of good and evil. And that's what religion offers people. That's the whole image of great battle, of great warfare that is part of every religious tradition. And you're saying, yeah, but of course, it's a metaphor, right? I mean, when the preacher with this camouflaged outfit, I mean, he didn't mean actually pick up a gun and go out and start shooting people. He was talking about the internal war of the spirit, the battle of good and evil. That's what he was talking about, right? Yeah, that's what he was talking about, except that there are some Christians who don't see it that way. There are Christians who, in fact, take that idea of war literally. They are fighting, and we're talking about the Aryan nations, Richard Butler, and the people who bombed Ruby Ridge and Oklahoma City Federal Building with Timothy McVeigh. And if you don't think he was religious, read the book, the Turner Diaries, which he kept in his car. It was all about this battle of the brotherhood, this monastic order that was more true to Christian identity and a fighter for Christianity identity than those the liberal and even the conservative churches that had sold out to multiculturalism and to modernity. And he was going to show the right way to save Christendom. The same is true of Anders Breivik in Norway. And it's so interesting how one of the recent acts of terrorism has kind of emulated, the one in New Zealand has emulated the same idea of Breivik, that it was trying to cure the society of multiculturalism. He saw that the acceptance of people from various different traditions, different walks of life, particularly Muslims, into a society that's predominantly Christian, I'm afraid that this is going to transform things forever. It's ridiculous, of course. It makes no sense. Multiculturalism is part of the wonderful thing that makes our society and modern societies around the world so interesting and to be truthful, it brings us great food, doesn't it? I mean, where would we be without the wonderful Thai restaurants and without the wonderful food from different parts of the world? Precisely because we are an open and accepting society. And yet there are people who say, no, we have to defend Christendom. This is what Anders Breivik thought he was doing. This is what the attacker in New Zealand thought he was doing, to try to defend Christendom in an awful kind of way. This is the attack on Atlanta during the Olympics, when a guy associated with the Christian identity movement was trying to keep the Olympics, this symbol of multiculturalism, from being in American soil. I interviewed this guy who's a Lutheran pastor near Washington, D.C. Looks like a normal Lutheran pastor. And yet he wrote this book, A Time to Kill. And it was a book about attacking abortion clinics, which he did. He was convicted for 3 years of attacking abortion clinics all up and down the east coast of the United States. He said the time has come, where Christians have to act. They have to actually engage in the battle. For him, the war was not a metaphor. And one of his best friends, David Hill, this is a Presbyterian pastor. We're not talking about extreme Christians, extreme little fringe sect groups. We're talking about Lutherans and Presbyterians. He thought he read a passage of scripture in Pensacola, Florida, that allowed him to go out and start shooting abortion clinic staff as they were going towards their offices. And he must have known that as soon as he killed them, which he did, shot 3 in cold blood, that he would be arrested by the Florida state troopers who were there protecting the clinic, and then taken off, and then ultimately tried and executed by the state of Florida. Was he a Christian suicide activist? This idea of the implanting of cosmic war, the great image of warfare from religious unto contemporary life, is something that's a part of every religious tradition, and perhaps most notably with these, identified with these 2 iconic towers. Well, before 9/11, there was an earlier period, 1995, when there was also an attempt to try to, 1993, when there was also an attempt to try to destroy the World Trade Center building by the very same people. Same cast of characters. Ramzi Youssef, one of the key people of this of the attack in 1993, was the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who was the key guy, the key conspirator in the 9/11 attacks. You think it's Osama bin Laden, but the 9/11 Commission report proves conclusively that it was Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. But back in 1993, when they tried to attack the World Trade Center, all that happened was a huge hole was produced under one of the sub-basements in one of the buildings. If they had been successful, the idea was to blow that sucker up and right next to a central column. If they had been successful, they would have brought down one of those huge towers immediately, not the hour or so that took a 9/11, which thousands of people mercifully were able to flee and be rescued. But in 1993, it would have come down immediately, and it would have come down on the side next to the other tower. So like trees falling in the forest, if trees falling in the forest, first tower would fall in the second tower would have fallen in all of the buildings in the shadow of those 2 enormous edifices. And if you go to Lower Manhattan right now, you'll see that there's a nice little memorial for 9/11, but right across the street there are tall buildings. Haven't been touched. If they had been successful in 1993, those suckers would have come down. And I did the math, some 25,000 people in either building, another 25,000 people visiting, and there's 100,000, another 100,000 in the neighboring building. 200,000 people would have lost their lives if they had been successful in 1993. So 3,000 did die, which is horrible, but it was a colossal thing, and yet somehow it just kind of didn't make an impact on it. It didn't happen. So it didn't happen, so all right, let's go on with life as normal. Sorry about my cold. So these guys who were rounded up and convicted for that attack. Ramzi Youssef, I mentioned, was the nephew of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Guy down in the lower left-hand corner is Mahmoud Abuelima, whom Time magazine regarded as the organizer of the whole thing. And I said, I want to talk to this guy. I want to try to get inside of his mind. So found out that I said I'm willing to go wherever he was. I was in Santa Barbara, which is where I live in California. And it turns out, after anywhere in the United States, wherever they've got him, I'll go there. And he was at Lompoc. You know where that is. It's just a little town about 20 miles up the coast from Santa Barbara, where the federal penitentiary, the one that's the successor of Alcatraz, is for the most dangerous federal prisoners. So I talked on several occasions with Abuelima. It took forever to get, it's almost harder to break into prison than to break out of it. So I had to go through his lawyer, I had to go through the warden, I had to go through all kind of security checkups. They cleared the whole cafeteria out so I could meet with him privately. I had a whole circle of guards around me because they're afraid that he'd try to grab me and take me hostage. But it was a very affable, I don't know what you expect a terrorist to be like, but whatever it was, he wasn't like that. He had a tall, friendly, freckled guy who loved just chatting away about everything. Relatively good English, he babbled away. I was going to Norway. He said, well, look out for those blonde women, you know, they'll have to carry you away. And he had been married for a while to a German woman. He's just a very affable, friendly guy until the subject came to religion and politics. And then he leaned over at me and looked very intensely, and he said, Mr. Mark, he says, you people don't know what's going on. You're hoodwinked. You know, the government doesn't tell you, and the newspapers are controlled by Jews, and they don't tell you what's really going on in the world. He says, there's a war going on, Mr. Mark. There's a battle between good and evil and right and wrong and religion and irreligion, and your government is the enemy. They're behind all of this. They're trying to keep you from knowing what's really happening. So you people ought to be shaken awake. Somebody should grab you by the shoulders and shake you so you can really see what's happening. You need something to open your eyes. I suddenly thought for a second. I said, well, is that why people bomb buildings? He just looked at me and he smiled and said, well, now you know. Now you know. So the whole idea, when we take terrorism as it's supposed to lead to something. No. He wanted us to see, to feel what it was like to be at war. To create an event so colossal, like a great beast summer movie, you knew that there was something big happening, that there was a war going on. He wanted what he felt, this experience of a world at war. So this is a remarkable thing. This idea of cosmic war, this notion that comes out of Scripture, that comes out of every religious tradition, whether it's Hinduism, Mahabharata, and the Ramayana, and the Buddhist chronicles and their struggles, or the great battles of in Islam and in Christianity and Judaism. Every religious tradition has these images of warfare, and often they're appropriated to think in terms of real wars, that behind battle on the secular level there is a metaphysical battle between truth and evil, and good and evil, and good, truth and untruth, and religion and non-religion, and that's cosmic war. And something like 9/11, of course, was cosmic war on a global scale. An event meant as much for CNN and maybe more importantly Al Jazeera as it was for anybody who directly witnessed it. And so for For a moment, they controlled our perception of the world. It's kind of like street theater, where, you know, suddenly you're drawn into some drama that you hadn't planned on being a part of, and suddenly you're getting to see the world in which that drama portrays it, and so you're drawn into this view of the world at war, and sometimes it works. Day afterwards, headlines of all the paper were not just an act of treason, but we're at war. Didn't say that the first day. I did a search of all of the headlines in the newspapers right around 9/11. It wasn't until the second day that the word war appeared in huge letters on the covers of most newspapers, in quotes. Who said that? President Bush. So this is not just an act of terrorism, an act of war. We bit the bait. The whole war on terror. No, it's not just a tardy little small band of people up in the mountains someplace in Afghanistan with a crazy idea to do this horrible thing, which is pretty much the case. No, it had to be something bigger than that. And there's still sizable parts of our population that think that the whole Muslim world is out to get us, because to do something like this had to be more than just a small little bunch of people up in a cave in Afghanistan, right? Wrong. But we were caught up, like they thought, that we were involved in war. So religion contributes to these images of cosmic war. And so it helped to answer that part of the question, why religion? Religion offers much more, of course, in terms of mobility and networking and legitimacy, but also these images of war. But why now? This has always been the case. So I went back to the case of the Sikhs. One of the interesting things about the case of the Sikhs was that, as I said, it was not just the religionization, the politicization of religion. Religion brought into politics, but the religionization of politics, where politics was seen to have a kind of a religious vibrancy to it. And so the enemy, it turned out, was not other Hindus or other Muslims, but the secular state. In this sense that in late modernity and an era of globalization, where the one thing that during the time of the Enlightenment, European Enlightenment several centuries ago, we thought was bringing progress and modernity and a kind of equality and justice to the world, is often seen in many parts of the world as a failed project, as a failed experiment, something that's brought corruption, that's brought greed, that's brought inefficiency, that has not been successful in its own terms, and perhaps most significantly lacks a sense of morality, a sense of purpose in public life. And so religion is seen as the new champion of the nation state, the new enemy of secularism. Well, curious, how odd. So in the case of India, it became enormously puzzling to Indira Gandhi, the prime minister, who simply couldn't understand how these people in their battlefield up in the Golden Temple in Amritsar couldn't come to some sort of negotiated agreement. Why couldn't they? Why don't we just sit down and talk about these things? But she didn't realize there was nothing to talk about, because it wasn't that it wasn't a normal kind of political discussion. She was a symbol of a kind of politics which was by its very nature inauthentic. And there was really nothing that she could do. In fact, everything she could do was seen as counterproductive. They were holed up in the Golden Temple, in the precincts. It's like there was a radical Italian group holed up in the Vatican. And so she was trying to figure out, poor Mrs. Gandhi, what on earth she could possibly do. And so she did probably the worst thing you can do in a situation like this. She listened to her military advisors. So note to self, if you're ever in a situation where you have a bunch of terrorists and your military advisors are trying to tell you what to do, don't listen to them. At least think twice. Because what they said is, I've heard this, in Washington so many times I can't tell you, it's sickening. They said, these people don't understand one thing is violence, fire fights fire. You have to chop off the head of the snake if you want to kill the snake. He said, you have to move in quickly, you have to come in with overwhelming force and destroy it, and the whole thing will be over in a minute. She said, great. So that's what she authorized, and sure enough, the military showed up and they couldn't get the front door down and they had to bring in backup. In the meantime, Bindewal and his forces brought in their own backup from the back door. They didn't know there was a back door. So it went on, the pitched battle went on for over a week. Over 1,000 pilgrims who were caught in the middle were killed during the process. Bender and Ali himself was finally killed, but the whole precinct of the Golden Temple was destroyed, angering Sikhs around the world. I mean, think what Catholics would feel if there was some sort of pitched battle going on in the Vatican and the Italian government destroyed St. Peter's, cathedral. I mean, it's just unimaginable. So even Sikhs who had previously been her supporters, like her own bodyguards who were Sikhs, turned to her as she walked through her garden, riddled her full of bullets. She lay dying, bleeding. She was killed. And then movement got worse. Things got worse. The battle between Sikhs and the secular state. Thousands of Sikhs were killed, and then the movement itself gained a whole new power that it hadn't gained before. It was enormously counterproductive, as it turns out, and it unleashed a whole new round of violence. The cosmic war, it turned out, had not been conquered by normal means. And the tensions between religion and the secular state have continued. In India now, the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party, is arguably the largest religious nationalist party in the world. Now, Modi is a fairly competent politician, but he's also very pro-Hindu, and a lot of Muslims feel marginalized. A lot of secular academics, particularly, and the universities feel that he is trying to push an agenda on them in terms of rewriting history. So there is this undercurrent, a rise of religious nationalism everywhere, and sometimes has its violent tinges. And in Ahmedabad, riots took place where Hindus, using the name of Lord Shiva, in the name of Hinduism, attacked Muslims in the suburbs, killing thousands, roasting them alive, burning them alive. We saw these images from ISIS of people being burned alive, and here Hindus are killing Muslims, innocent Muslims, in this very same way, for whom there had been no cause other than the fact that just their faith. And at the time, the chief minister of the state was accused himself of being a terrorist. He's now the Prime Minister of India, Modi. And the member of his cabinet, the health minister, actually was convicted of terrorism because she handed out some of these machetes at the edge of the neighborhood and urged the Hindus to go in and slaughter the Muslims. And then she has served prison time as a convicted terrorist. She's on the cover of my book. One woman I have as an example of a religious terrorist convicted by the Indian government because of her role in this attack on the Muslims in Gujarat. But we had to look around, and this rise of religious nationalism in opposition to the secular state seemed to be a troublingly consistent pattern. In Sri Lanka, for example, this is not very long ago, where there was a peace procession in Colombo, led by Buddhist monks. And you're saying, Buddhist monks? Aren't they the most peaceful religion in the world? Why, I'm sure Professor Jerrison tells you, oh, that's right, he is also the most famous person in the world who's exposed the violent side of Buddhism, so he probably didn't tell you this exactly. But many of you may think that Buddhism is the most peaceful religion in the world. Well, yeah, sure. I mean, every religion is, the very name Islam means peace. Every religious tradition trumpets peace, and yet there's this ugly side. Like these guys, they were stopping the peace process, and with clubs, they were beating on this multicultural group of Buddhists and Hindus and Christians and Muslims, and they're saying, if you want peace, go back to India. You don't stay in Sri Lanka. There'll be no peace until Sri Lanka is a Sinhalese Buddhist nation. Exactly the same position is taken in Myanmar. This last year when I was in Myanmar, formerly called Burma, the city of Mandalay, talking with this guy, Ashin Wiratu, who is just the week before had been on the cover of Time magazine with the caption, "The Buddhist Face of Terror." And when I came in, you can see he's cheerful. When I came in, he looked at me and he laughed and he said, I look like a terrorist, ha 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 ha. And I would say, yeah, you look like most of the terrorists I've dealt with. I mean, banal. There's something really remarkably troubling about the fact that people can be engaged in, as he has been, rabble-rousing against the Muslim minority in Myanmar, particularly in Rohingya in the northwestern part of the country, in ways that excite mobs to go up and set fire to mosques, set fire to shops where Muslims live, burning them alive. Buddhists is extraordinary. And I said to him, I said, as a Buddhist, how can you justify this violence? He says, oh, we're Buddhists, we believe in nonviolence. I said, yes, I know that. We believe in nonviolence. I said, yes, I know that. How am I going to get out of this? I said, but you also believe in defending the Buddhist community. He said, yes, especially against our enemies. I said, and what enemies might those be? He said, those people who are trying to destroy Buddhism. Well, who are those exactly? Those Muslims. They're out to try to get us in. We need to defend ourselves. We need to get them before they get us. It's just a tiny percentage of Muslims in Burma, but he had this map up on his wall with all the different colors of religion on the map, and he said, look at Christianity, huge wash, here's Islam, huge wash, and then Burmese Buddhism, he talked about it as if it was a special kind of Buddhism, exists only here, this tiny little drop, and we're in danger of being forever swept away. So for him, what we see as horrible acts of terrorism was a defense, part of a cosmic war, a struggle to maintain a kind of religious purity, even if it was a fictitious struggle, even if the threat was not real, but in his mind and in the minds of his followers. One of the first religious nationalist states was in Iran. And even before the era of globalization and the Cold War, goes back to 1978. And the interesting thing about the rise of the Ayatollah Khomeini was not that he was just against the Shah and the excesses of the secret police, but also because he was raiding against something he called West toxification, inebriation of things Western. And I remember I was there in Tehran before the revolution, and I had a friend who was Persian from graduate school, and I stopped off to see him. He's a Marxist and he was an activist, and we went out partying, and man, we went to nightclubs in Tehran up to like 4 o'clock in the morning. And I said, this is great, is this like San Francisco? And then the mullahs come to town and they see the nightclubs and the parties and they say, this looks like San Francisco. Didn't have the same resonance to them that it did to me. West toxification. In an era of globalization, West toxification is kind of what the internet promotes and what YouTube promotes, what this kind of immediate, kind of rapid social connection that we all feel through the internet. And if you're in part of traditional cultures, that has to be threatening to traditional leaders. It has to be threatening to people who see the very nature of their community, their culture is being corroded. And they want to rescue it. They want to cure West toxification, and so that's the project. In Egypt, the sense of secularism as a political threat has been there ever since the founding of Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood back in the 1930s. But it's been a fairly small movement until fairly recently. Again, these movements that have been around for a while now are gaining traction with a sense of an era of globalization, the threat to distinctive cultures and the threat to distinctive nationalisms, and try to attempt to, in some ways, anti-globalization, to try to reassert the identities of particular communities and, of course, the power that's associated with the traditional leadership. So we saw for a while the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, even for a while, positions taking the reign of power until al-Sisi and the military government was way too threatened and now has replaced it with their own kind of secular politics. But across the border, excuse me, in Palestine, this same Muslim Brotherhood identity was picked up by this guy, implanted on a secular movement, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And you're saying, what? Wait a second. Well, I thought that Jews and Muslims have been fighting each other. That's what you hear. How can you possibly solve the problem with Israel and Palestine? Because Jews and Muslims have been at each other's necks in this part of the world forever. No, they haven't. I don't know who told you that, but it's simply not true. Now, there have been tensions between some of the early Jewish settlers in the 19th century and their Muslim neighbors, but to a large extent, there was a peaceful relationship, including and fairly recently, the state of Israel was found to be a secular state. I don't care what Netanyahu says, that's the way it was founded. And everybody who lived there had equal rights, they had civil liberties. And the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, was a totally secular organization. I've talked with Yasser Arafat's family. They're as secular as can be. Arafat himself, the leader of PLO, was married not to a Muslim, but to a Christian woman. She was Palestinian Christian, but Christian. It was not a religious cause. And when that changed was the time of the first Intifada around 1990, when this guy, Sheikh Yassin, who was involved with kind of a consortium with other sheikhs, brought religion into the picture. Sorry, excuse me. So a struggle was religionized. And when I talked with Sheikh Yassin about that time, he conferred me that Palestine would never be free until it was a Muslim Palestine. Now the interesting thing was, I talked with this guy just the day before. And this guy is not a Muslim sheikh. He's a Jewish rabbi, actually from Brooklyn, a guy named Meir Kahane, who had his own program of Jewish nationalism. He hated the secular state of Israel because he thought it should be a Jewish state. It should be fulfilling the promise of biblical Israel. And so he was inspired by the idea that Israel should be biblical Israel. And that meant taking over the area that had been primarily biblical lands in the West Bank. That happens to be where Palestinians live. He had nothing against Palestinians, he said, except they just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time because something great is happening in history. We are creating the conditions for the coming of the Messiah. Woo! And if you're Jewish and you are a Messianic Jew and you have an expectation and a hope of the coming of the Messiah, who wouldn't want that to happen? And if those people happen to be in the way, that's their problem. Goodbye, Palestinians. And that was his position. Considered to be a real extremist, a real radical, at least at the time. Increasingly less so, unfortunately. Kahane himself was killed, in fact, by this guy Mahmoud Abulim I interviewed, was part of the group that killed him in Manhattan when he came to New York to give a talk to raise money. But the movement's still alive, and this guy I talked with just this last year, like a 20-year-old kid, is kind of the new face of some of the very same ideas. I thought, whoa, this is extraordinary. He sounds exactly like Meir Kahane. This guy on the left is not Meir Kahane, he's Meir Ettinger, but his mother's name was Kahane. He is the grandson of Meir Kahane. Leader of something called the Hilltop Gang. Gang of people, kids who, they round up, I thought I had it, but a slide of me in a Palestinian village where they had firebombed the village to try to get rid of the Palestinians. Because Kahane had, and this is my picture of Kahane in the Sheraton Hotel in Jerusalem with a new flag that he put up for a new flag of Israel, free Israel, in any part of the West Bank that is relinquished by the Israeli government because he's claimed it for biblical purposes. So when Yitzhak Rabin, Prime Minister, shook hands with Yasser Arafat in the Rose Garden with Bill Clinton kind of looking on approvingly, it was a wonderful moment of peace for most of the world, but not to this guy, Yigal Amir, and many of his cohorts in Israel who thought that he was giving up biblical land and giving up biblical prophecy. So he is recreating the event when Yigal Amir, after a triumphal speech in the main square of Tel Aviv, was walking down the stairs and this guy came with his gun and then pumped him full of bullets, and he lay dying on the ground. And here are all the young Israelis coming to mourn the passing of this great leader. Years later, I talked with his widow, who said, we never expected he would be in danger by another Jew, maybe by a Muslim, but not by another Jew. But he was, and this is my own picture of the memorial. Beautiful memorial has been produced on the site give a kind of like eternal fire at the very steps that he was walking down in order to leave the podium, which was a peace rally. And Israel really has not gained that same traction towards peace negotiation with the Palestinians ever since. The prime minister who was elected later on that year was Netanyahu, who has been off and on prime minister ever since, with a whole different approach and pandering to those extremist parties like the ones that Mayor Kahane was a part of. Switch to a different part of the world, South Asia. One of the last vestiges of the Cold War was in Afghanistan, where at that time the U.S. supported the Mujahideen, the Muslim fighters against the secular Soviet Union. But all that's changed now because the new successors of the Mujahideen are the Taliban, some of the same people actually. And the new secular intruders that they're fighting against is not the Soviet Union, but us. So the United States now is seen as the kind of secular foreign authority that's trying to control Afghanistan and keep it from being truly Muslim and true to its culture, which is why we're losing in Afghanistan. It's a hopeless situation because poor Obama was trying to get out of Afghanistan, but he didn't want to have a train wreck behind it, and that meant keeping some sort of support, but whatever support, particularly whatever military presence the U.S. kept there, it was going to be targets of the Taliban because we became visible symbols of this war between religion and the secular state. And that continues to be the case even today. Meanwhile, across the border in Pakistan, the anti-Americanism is absolutely off the charts. Every time there's a drone strike, horrible things happen. So when we decided to invade Iraq, in an act that many Americans thought was kind of retribution for 9/11, even though Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11. But in many people's mind, it was a way of getting at those people from over there, whoever they were and whatever they're trying to do. But in doing that, we unleashed a whole new form of religious violence and religious organization. Because Saddam Hussein, who was a secular socialist leader, had pretty much kept the tensions of the sectarian movements pretty much at bay. But that's not what happened after the American invasion in 2003. Here I am showing up in Baghdad, talking with the mullah and the senators from Al-Anbar province, who explained that they are fearing that the revolution they hoped to happen was being undercut by the American presence. And you can look at a map of Afghanistan and you can understand the situation. Sunni Arabs control only the western part. The eastern, southeastern are Shia, and Sunni Kurds, the northern part. 60% of the population is Shia, which means that when George Bush talked about democracy, Sunni said, we're screwed. Sunni says that means we're, the minority. So you can see why ISIS, based on a previous movement called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, could sweep through eastern Syria, which has its own problems with a Shia-related government in Damascus, and Sunni Arabs who felt marginalized, and then connect with the marginalized Sunni Arabs in Iraq to create a whole new Islamic state, led under the most oppressive and evil and terrorist, where torture was a means of political control. What a hideous thing ISIS was. I just came back from Iraq and was able to talk with people, actually former ISIS leaders in prison. And I can tell you some of them are still committed. They still feel that they were on the right path towards a caliphate. Some of them are like al-Baghdadi, who proclaimed himself as a caliph in a way to try to realize this particular form of apocalyptic Islam. And yet, most of the followers of ISIS were like these guys. It was just normal people from Sunni Arabs who felt marginalized, who felt screwed, they felt left out of politics was increasingly only for Shia, and still the case, by the way. And so for them, and this is last week when I was there, going to this town, totally destroyed, as you can see, right next to Mosul. And these thousands of people, so where do these people live now? Because, oh, by the way, when I tried to get out of the car this last week, I wanted to take some pictures. It said, don't take a step outside the car, you would get blown up. There are landmines around. So even if you could get through the landmines and get to the houses, what would people do if they're trying to rebuild things, rebuild their lives? Their places have been destroyed. And so, as I say, they live in these huge tented cities that were created by the UN High Commission for Refugees. It's a wonderful thing. It's created like a whole, like these are like 28 tents, 14 on either side, and inside their kitchens, and then bathrooms for the men and women on either end. There's schools for the kids, hospitals. They've done a wonderful job in creating emergency facilities, but there they are. And what are they going to have? What are they going to do now? Because once the Americans came and helped destroy Mosul, they're gone. They're not helping Mosul rebuild as a city. The government from Baghdad, they say, oh, well, you guys figure something out. They're not doing anything to help rebuild the city of Mosul. It's been destroyed. You know, you need money, you need infrastructure. In the meantime, they're out here. And so the word I got was that there are a lot of rumors of ISIS picking up again. Yeah, you heard this last week that supposedly ISIS has been destroyed territorially. Yeah, and yet I can tell you, from having been there and talked with people, the spirit is alive, and the spirit is alive because of the resentment, the marginalization of people like these guys that I talk with, who at one time supported the Islamic State, and yet at this moment, even though they no longer support it, they're trying to figure out what they do with their lives. They're trying to figure out where they go next. You know, it was a strange religion, but now they're trying to regroup their lives. Even these people who are not Muslims, they're Yazidis. They're trying to figure out how to live once their town of Sinjar has been destroyed in the effort to try to cure it from ISIS. I'll leave this. We're about to close up, right? We're running out of time. So let me leave this last slide, because I just talked with this boy last week. He was one of the last fighters in Baghouz. And you may have heard that last little sliver of land just fell to no longer is controlled by ISIS. In the last battle, this is one of the last ISIS fighters, this 16-year-old boy on my left. And the reason why I'm talking with you, and he's not in jail, is he's not a Muslim. So it turns out he was a Yazidi. Yazidi is this ancient religion. And when ISIS overran this Yazidi community and took these people, it regarded the Yazidis as devil worshippers because it's an ancient religion. It goes pre-Zoroastrian. It worships the sun, among other things. And it killed most of the men, took the women into sex slavery. That previous picture was of a woman who was telling me how she had saved her daughters when they were about to be taken, auctioned off for a few dollars to dirty old men, as she described it, to try to protect them. When you can see those are her daughters behind it, she was successful. But this guy, he was also became a slave. He was sold to a series of guys who then had him do housework, until finally this last year, when ISIS as a movement was falling apart and they needed fighters, they said, okay, we need you as a fighter. They taught him to speak Arabic. He, again, forget his language, native language, it's Kurdish. He was forgetting that. He only spoke Arabic. He said, okay, we'll make you a fighter. And the kid said, okay, whatever you want me to do. So he was fighting against the Peshmerga in Baghouz when a mortar round hit, and you can see he had his crutches on the side, and shattered his leg, and he was taken to a field hospital. And when he was able to walk, the people in the field hospital said, get the hell out of here. He says, the ISIS is falling apart, don't go back. And he said, we know you're a Yazidi, you're not a Muslim. And so he hobbled over to the Peshmerga, and to their surprise, they said, what are you doing here? And he says, help, I'm not a Muslim, I'm a Yazidi. And so they took him in, and he was on television, and his grandfather is the only member of the family left who saw him. And he was taken to this village just the day before, and the day afterwards is when I took this picture and I was talking with him. And he told me his whole story. It was just so poignant. So here we are, in kind of living with the rise of religious violence in so many different parts of the world. A combination of images of cosmic war and alienated people with shattered worldviews for whom these images of kind of a religious community and a religious politics are an attempt to reassert their own shattered selves, to try to reconnect in a community of faith and trust, the kind of promise of moral public life that all of us should be inheritors of. Well, thank you very much for being so patient. Look forward to our conversation.